So this episode is going to be a challenge to you as a creator, as a photographer, as someone maybe like that comes up with excuses sometimes for going out there and creating. And yeah, the whole reason why we do this channel is to inspire you and help you grow in your craft. And I think this episode is going to do just that. Going to be interviewing photographer Wesley Verhoeve, as well as Dan Rubin, who's a photographer and designer. Wesley is just coming out with a photo book called Notice. And I'm really excited for it. It's on pre-order. We're going to be talking about that, the process of making the book, as well as the process of designing and then putting the book together that is soon to hopefully be in your hands if you want to order it. But welcome to the show. Welcome to the channel, Wesley and Dan.
Well, thanks so much for having us, Braden. We really appreciate it and love the channel. So it's really exciting to get to talk to you and then to your viewers as well.
Something really fun is right as COVID was happening, I interviewed Wesley. We were all locked in. I started doing these Zoom interviews as I was planning on traveling all over and doing in-person interviews. And we started talking about what he's up to. And he's in the small town. Wesley's usually traveling the world. He is usually he shoots these amazing portraits of people on the street, not just street photography, but stopping people, strangers he doesn't know, and taking their portraits on the street. They're really, really amazing. But he's usually in a different country almost every couple months, and he was stuck in a small town, and so he was just walking through the streets, the same path every day, and noticing what he was seeing and taking photographs of it, which has become the project called Notice, which is now a book that is coming out really soon, April 27th, and we'll have links down below for that. But Wesley, will you just talk about that process of shooting, what it's taught you, and then we'll get into the book and the design, but can you just start talking about where this idea came from and what you've been learning from it?
Right. Well, a bigger town, but in a small neighborhood. So I was, like you said, traveling the world, taking portraits of people on the street. And like, that's my whole bread and butter. So even the commercial shoots that I do are based around the people that I cast on the street on personal work, like what you just described. And so I was going from Tokyo to Berlin to Buenos Aires to Mexico City, and then Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And I was going to be there for 2.5 months or so. And then COVID happened. Borders closed, all my jobs were canceled. I got stuck not even in the proper city of Vancouver, but in a suburban section of Vancouver. Very beautiful, but nothing going on. And especially during lockdown, really nothing was going on. So I couldn't do any of my normal things. I couldn't walk around busy areas because there weren't any people on the street. I couldn't take portraits because there weren't any people on the street. I couldn't do any of my work because it was all canceled. And so I had to come up with a way to kind of make sense of the world as it became this crazy, unsure place. And I'm a very routine-based person, and I kind of latch onto kind of habits and rituals to ground myself in a time period or in a place. And so when I'm traveling, for example, I always have like the same coffee shop that I go to in the morning to do a little bit of work and have my little breakfast. And in this case, what I ended up doing is there was not much I could do. So I just decided, okay, well, I'm going to go for a walk every day. Same time of day. I'm going to just walk and bring my camera and see what happens, see what I notice. And because of the circumstances, I couldn't run around fast in busy areas. So I had to be in this suburb, this very quiet, no people on the street suburb. And my whole photography practice had to change. I had to go slower. I had to start focusing on little things that I usually would run right past. And over time, when we were talking last time, I had just kind of started doing this, and it was giving me kind of a meditative quality. It was helping me calm down in the kind of crazy time, but I didn't really know yet what it was going to be. And I think that's a lesson that I've learned here, where you don't necessarily have to plan the whole thing out. You can just kind of do a thing. So I did these daily walks, and with time, it became clear what my photography was becoming. I was noticing specific things. I was noticing nature change. I was feeling myself more connected to the real world because I was walking in the same neighborhood every day. And I did that for 123 days in a row. And that became a body of work that is now a book.
That is incredible, and definitely something I wanted to talk to with how you went through. What was it you shot? Like 1,400 images, 3,200 images?
34,000 images.
Right, that's what I meant. I meant 34,000 images. And then whittling that down, how many ended up in the actual book?
83.
Now that is some editing, and we'll get back into that, and I'm sure Dan will have some things to say. But I really just wanted to get back into the root of just the heart of this project in a way that can hopefully challenge you, like anyone that's watching and listening. That, and then Wesley will love some of your input on this. But really, this idea that so many of us feel like we have to go and travel the world to come away with something incredible. You look on Instagram, you look at what everybody else is doing or was doing to get incredible images, and they're somewhere else, right? They're not in your hometown, they're not where you live, they're not in your backyard. And because sometimes where we are feels really mundane. But this idea that you have the opportunity to go out and create in your backyard and you don't have to travel the world, but just through, Wesley, the process of doing this project, and this was different than what you normally do. So how did this challenge you? How can you use this or then explain it to somebody else who's watching, just so they can take it and be inspired and go create or go do?
Absolutely. I mean, the way it challenged me was that it was not something I would have chosen to do. I would have not chosen to be in a suburb the whole time and walk around these quiet streets with like manicured lawns and beautiful flowers. And I mean, it was very beautiful and calming and a nice place to live, but it wouldn't have ever been something I would have chosen for myself as a canvas to make work on. And so, um, something that I learned is that through this process of paying better attention and being more focused on the real world outside of what I would usually be looking at, which is people, I discovered that in this very small, what felt to me like a very kind of almost claustrophobic environment, it was a small neighborhood, very much like repetition in terms of how certain things looked. And I discovered with time that in this small world, it was actually this giant universe of tiny little bits of beauty and unexpected like ways of light hitting a garage door, or flowers coming up one week and then dying the next week, and other flowers coming up in that same place. So that repetition of walking those same streets every day showed me there was so much more to the eye than I would have realized beforehand, before I started paying attention to all of these things.
So Wesley, how, like, let's say someone is watching this and they are inspired and they're like, I want to go out and I want to start shooting more, or I want to just start walking around my own neighborhood and I want to start creating or documenting the life around me. Whether maybe it's your own kids that you want to document, just your own home life, your own house. Like there's a lot of things that you could be taking pictures of. But from what you learned in this process, how would you instruct someone to start doing this when you're going out, not necessarily like having an absolute exact intention of what you're wanting to come away with, but you're just going out there to shoot? Like how would you help someone do this, or just give some tips on what you learned through this process?
I think there's two things. One is, many of us, myself included, have a tendency to overthink and want to control a situation. And in this case, I had to let go. I had to not try to control or force something in. I just had to let it happen. I had to let the work come to me. I had to let the images come to me by paying better attention. So one thing is, turn your brain off and just engage in the act of photography. Don't try to think ahead of like, oh, I want to do a project about this and that. No, just go out and see what emerges. And then the second point is, what works really well for me is to make one decision up front and stick with that decision. For example, in this case, that means I decided before, like in the first day that I started doing these walks, I decided, okay, I'm going to do this every day, same time of day, rain or shine. It doesn't have to be the same, like 2 hours every day. If it's raining or it's just not happening, I don't have to do it for 2 hours, but every day I will go out and I will go shoot. Some days I might get a lot. Some days I might think that I got nothing and turned out I actually got a lot. It's making that decision up front that removes the possibility of wavering on that commitment later on. Because if I had to make that decision every day, I would get up and be like, oh, should I do another walk today? Well, it's not nice out, or I'd come up with all these excuses, right? We were talking about excuses before we started this conversation. I eliminated these excuses by making that one decision up front. And so that's another big tip that came out of this for me. make one choice and stick with that, and don't let yourself waver because whatever excuse you can come up with will pop up, you know?
Yeah, man. That idea of having a scheduled something in place, like the idea of habit. I'm such a big proponent of habit, and really at the end of the day, like we get decision fatigue. If you're having to make decisions about when you do what, how you do it, it's so easy to come up with excuses. And I don't know how many videos we can link to, but I'm going to try to link another video up here that I did where I was just it's like for this channel, I try to create a video per week, and that can get daunting as you're trying to, like, expectations are high on myself of trying to come up with something good that's going to be educational plus a little entertaining, and to like think of something new is really difficult. But what I ended up doing was scheduling once a week. I hired a videographer and we booked a time every week. And so and then if I was going to leave it to the last minute, we'd have nothing planned. But by having something scheduled, it's sort of like a habit, like that time that you're going to go on a walk, that time you're going to go do the thing, that schedule helped create structure so that I could go and create. Because if I didn't book that time or have that habit already in place of going out and doing, then there's a strong chance it would just never happen and never happen. All of a sudden 3 weeks go by and I haven't created. 3 weeks have gone by and you haven't gone out and shot, things like that. But I don't know, being able to implement structure actually creates freedom. It's so strange how that works, but boundaries create, your constraints can actually help you create. But Dan, I would love to hear your thoughts. You're a guy that's also traveled the world and is an incredible photographer, but on this topic, could you just expand on it and give your thoughts on working with Wesley through this, but then also just limiting factors and excuses, or just getting out and shooting?
Well, it's been a very similar situation for me now for just over a year. I've been kind of stranded a little bit in my hometown in South Florida, which is not a place that I ever took photos really. When I was still living here, I was maybe 3 or 4 years of my life that I lived here after discovering photography as a creative outlet. And I barely took any pictures here. It was never really inspiring at the time, even though I didn't have anything against Florida. I was more interested in taking pictures of new places, new things, new people. And so being back here again, I initially found that it was almost worse than not having anything interesting around, because obviously, as Wesley's saying, there's always something interesting around. It was more that I'd fell back into old muscle memory, and I just didn't pick up the camera every day. Whereas normally I wouldn't even have to think about going out for a walk wherever I was with a camera just to see what I would see. And so following along with Wesley's process, I didn't do a project like he did, obviously, and I ended up helping him produce this into a book, which was actually a really great way for me of revisiting my design roots and applying that to a project like this. But it helped me, and I know it helped a lot of other people watching as Wesley would share his progress. It reminded me that I needed to do the same thing here in this neighborhood where I grew up as well, which is kind of almost worse, because not only is this, normal and potentially not interesting, it's stuff that I stopped paying attention to decades ago. And none of the houses have really changed. None of the streets have changed. I used to ride my bike around here when I was like 8. So it's been fun to work through a lot of the stages of the project with Wesley, because it's forced me and reminded me to get out a whole lot more. And I'm pretty certain that I wouldn't have shot as much stuff around this area and gone out hunting intentionally had it not been for Wesley setting this kind of model and standard. Because he's totally right. Like if you make up your mind to do it, once you've done that, the decision is then easier. I certainly didn't to start with. My mind was kind of made up subconsciously that there was nothing here that was interesting. And so the first couple of months I was here, I didn't capture anything. And now I've been going out quite a bit, even if it's just with a smartphone, and taking advantage of when there's sun and not rain, or when I just have a moment to go out and look and hunt. And I think that's another important angle of this, is that in Wesley's case, it didn't start out as a project, but it's ended up as a book, as a beautiful, wonderful book. But it doesn't have to. And no one who's listening to this should feel any pressure that, by setting that intention and going out and noticing and paying attention, it doesn't mean you have to turn it into something bigger. It can just be that process of doing, of the act. And that's enough, because it keeps your brain active.
And it's very for me at least, it was very meditative, because as someone with an overly busy brain, that's the only time I can really turn it off, when I'm doing this focused photo walking by myself, maybe with some music in my ear or a podcast, and I can be in a flow state. And that, if there wasn't even a book that came out of this, the whole thing would have been worth it, just for my personal, mental health and creative feelings and all that kind of stuff. But I'm just really grateful that in this case, Dan and several other people helped me actually turn this from what it was just something that benefited me to something that hopefully will inspire others.
So I read a ton of business books. I'm trying to think of the name of this book that was referencing a story that I'm going to tell, but I can't think of it. But what it was talking about was, it was this professor that he did an experiment with this class. He broke the class up in half, and where it said half the class is going to, their assignment was they could turn in one photo at the end of the year. It's a photo class. The other half of the class, they were graded on, and that's how they were graded on one photo. The other half of the class was graded on the volume of photos they took. It's not any particular photo, but just the more photos they took, the better the grade they got. And at the end of the year, to just like ruin the punchline, is for the kids that shot one photo, the kids that shot the volume had significantly better photos. They improved significantly more than the class or the group that had one photo. And a big portion of that was this group that had just the one photo. They were thinking about what they're going to take. They were second guessing what they were going to shoot. They didn't take a lot of photos because they had to have this one that was perfect, and they would procrastinate and they kept putting it off. Where this group that had to shoot the volume, they did shoot volume, and by doing that, they learned and they grew in their craft, and they become better photographers because they were practicing. A good book that I'll link to it below. It's by author Seth Godin. It's called The Practice. And he just beats it into you, talking about putting in the work and doing one of my favorite quotes is, do what you love is for amateurs and love what you do is for pros. So it's that element, I don't know, that's a whole different topic, but this idea of just putting in the practice and doing the work. But I'm beating that to a pulp.
I'd like to say one more thing
yeah.
to that. I think sometimes it can also be intimidating to not everybody has the opportunity and time to go out for a 2-hour photo walk, because work, jobs, and all that kind of stuff. And so I also would say it doesn't have to be 2 hours. Even if it's just your lunch break and it's 30 minutes, and you take, you eat your sandwich or whatever you're eating, and you go out, even if it's 20 minutes, if it's daily, you will get better and you will see your craft grow and your style change. So I think don't feel limited by it must be this many hours. It's more about the repetition. Like you said, like with Schwarzenegger, it's about the reps. It's not about the amount of time per rep.
I was just going to say, that's something that I've also encouraged people to do for years prior to the pandemic, right? When I get the opportunity to teach, when people ask, how do I get better as a photographer? My first answer is have a camera with you at all times, because what you find is that even if it's in your commute, right? Like outside of the pandemic, outside of lockdown, there are all of these opportunities in between, these moments and if you have a camera over your shoulder, your brain will automatically switch into that mode. If you don't have the camera with you, you won't be searching in the same way. And that's a really, really important thing, because as Wesley said, you can intentionally have like your lunch hour as a walk, but you can also just intentionally take the camera with you wherever you are. And that turns every little opportunity of life into those moments as well.
I think that's a really good point, Dan, of sometimes just setting the bar really high makes that it does become limiting, or it's that thing that prevents us. But just like starting off in little increments of maybe it's just like putting something on your calendar so you make it happen, and it does happen. And start low. It's like if you tell yourself I'm going to do 1,000 push-ups a week, that sounds really daunting. But if you break that down, okay, that means, 700 push-ups a week, that means it's only 100 push-ups a day. And then even 100 push-ups a day sounds like a lot. But then if you break that down, like what if I do 10 push-ups every minute I can do 10 push-ups. It's like that little element of breaking it down into little chunks, breaking down your habits into little actionable things. It actually makes it easier to happen. But I want to transition into the actual book and the design of the book and how you went from 84,000 images down to 34,000 images down to 83. And maybe Dan, you can talk about the design side, but would love for you, and then also you guys started a publishing company out of this too. So would love for you both to talk about that process and just sort of, talk to us about that.
Well, as far as like whittling the images down, I shot this book both in analog on various cameras and film stocks, as well as with one digital camera. And so I didn't actually get to see any of the analog photos until the whole thing was over, because there wasn't a lab that was open and that I liked in Vancouver. So I saved the whole thing up, and I ended up sending about 7 pounds of film to my lab in New York City, Bleecker Digital. And so I didn't get to see any of that. And so it was a big job to go through those photos. But thankfully, I did every day after my walk dump my digital files and go through them real quick and like look at, briefly which ones I liked and set those separate already. So I was lucky that my system of keeping notes and dumping files was already kind of giving me some sort of head start. But then when I got them all, it was pretty easy to go down from 34,000 to about 1,500, because there's, obviously I was walking the same neighborhood, so there's a lot of repetition as well, right? And so getting down to 1,500 took me a few days, but it was not that hard. Going from 1,500 to 500 got a little harder. And then once I got to 300, it got kind of impossible because I was too close to the work. And so it was very difficult for me to distinguish between a photo that was good or a photo that I felt a good feeling about, because I remembered the moment of taking the photo. And so that's when I had to bring in help. And so in addition to Dan becoming a huge part of that process, excuse me, I also set up Zooms with about 20 of my friends who are photographers, and some of them actually were not photographers, and that was intentional. And this was another thing that was kind of a gift of the pandemic, if you will, because usually if you share photos with pre-pandemic, I wouldn't have known about Zoom. I would have just sent them a folder or a PDF and been like, it's kind of a big ask. Hey, can you look at 300 photos and tell me what you think? That's not that fun to do, right? But because of Zoom, I was able to say, hey, hop on a Zoom with me for an hour. I'm going to screen share my Adobe Bridge, and I'm going to go quite quickly through images. And because I can see your face, I can see what you're responding to. And so because I did it with a relatively large number of people, about 20, and Dan was one of them, I was able to bring it down to about from 300-ish to about 120. And from that point onward, it was just Dan and I going into the sequencing and discovering that we had all these pairings, because I didn't shoot this book with this concept in mind. But what our first level of noticing was me being out shooting and noticing things. The second level of noticing was when I had the last, let's say, 250 pictures left, I did a test print of them all, and I put them all out on the floor, and I started noticing patterns between the images, whether it be similar compositions or shapes of things that had nothing to do with each other. But when you put them next to each other, they amplified each other, they echoed each other. And so once I got down to about 120 images, Dan and I focused on not just which images are the best ones, but which images pair well with another image. So the whole book, with the exception of about 7 photos, is left page, right page pairings, where the photos have something to do with each other. So that was the last phase of cutting down to 83.
Nice. Dan, will you speak a little bit into design and your involvement in hand playing with this book, and just even talking about how just design matters?
Sure. Well, the design process for me, and for the people who don't know and only know me as a photographer, my background is design. I've been a designer for over 25 years now, and doing it in a lot of different ways. So my headspace and design pair without me even having to work hard at it. And that's one of the reasons I love a project like this, that already before we even started the visual design process, made the curation process and the pairing process, once we got down to the end, that was part of the design process of the whole thing. Because when you're trying to if you're putting an exhibition together, you're still having to design the exhibition. You're still trying to think about how people will enter the space and interact with what's on the wall. And that is so integral and important, but a lot of people don't think about that. They don't think about putting together the core art and making those decisions as part of a design process, because a lot of people think of it as such a visual thing, that it's just about the wrapping. And so getting to work with someone like Wesley on this, who already understood that as a curator, not just as a photographer, made the whole process easier. Because for me, I wanted the visual design, the way that we packaged the book, to be directly tied in as many different ways as possible to the story, to that story of noticing and paying attention. So as Wesley just said, that pairing process and the sequencing, because it wasn't just about pairing, right? Wesley already mentioned how most of the pictures in the book are paired left and right, and there's a very, very intentional message behind those pairings, even if it's not overt. It's meant for people to also discover as they look through the book. So part of that theme of noticing is that you have to look at every pair, and the more you look at it, the more you find relationships between the images. And the same thing happened for the entire sequence as well. And I'm not going to say what Wesley and I think about the sequence, but I will say that when someone gets this book and they read through it, the linear arrangement of these images, it goes beyond just pairings. It's not just pair. There are a lot of subsequences within. There's a very intentional rhythm to how the book is organized, because I think that's very important. It's a very personal experience, right? When someone reads, or not reads, but it opens and flips through a photo book. And some photo books are very, very well designed in this way. They're designed as an experience. They're designed with a lot of intent from front to back, but not all are. So that was one of the themes for us throughout. We decided from the beginning we wanted to have a very classic approach to the visual design of it, to the aesthetic, which basically meant giving every image a lot of room to breathe. We didn't want this to be a coffee table book that would be massive. My first book that I did 5 years ago, Koya Bound, with Craig Maud, who you might have heard of, but who also has a lovely essay in Notice. There's a lot of wonderful overlaps here in the story. He and I made a coffee table book. So Wesley and I were talking about scale as one of our early discussions. And we wanted this to be a very personal book that would fit on a bookshelf, but also that when you're holding it, you don't feel like you have to work very hard. You can be very intimate with your relationship. And those are the kind of discussions basically that Wesley and I would have a lot. We weren't jumping straight into what typeface do we want to use and what do we want the cover to be? And we went through a bunch of iterations of size, for instance. We worked through a lot of different dimensions, a lot of different discussions of scale and proportion, because it was very important for us to allow people to feel like they could spend time with each image and with each spread, that it wasn't a quick book. It's a book that has to echo the whole concept of this practice, of this meditation. And a lot of the details that ended up in the final physical artifact come from that same thing. So the amount of time that Wesley and I have spent poring over linen to decide what exactly we want for the cover. It's not just about color, and the decisions about which color we used for the main cover and for the special edition, they come directly from themes that are within the book, which I'll let Wesley speak to in a minute. The typeface decisions are related. There are two typefaces in the book, and there's a direct relationship between those two typefaces. No one will know this stuff, but there's so much intention that has gone into each of those little decisions. And not all of that happens very quickly either. There's a lot of time that's spent, calendar time sometimes, and sometimes it's actual time where you're spending days and days, or maybe even weeks, going back and forth about the position of this pairing. Do we put this pairing here? Do we move this over here? Do we use this image in this sequence, or do we flip these things around? What color end papers do we have in this book, and how will that tie into the story? And then the story becomes, and it's about details at every point, because that's what noticing is about, is noticing things that you wouldn't normally pay attention to. So for designers, for instance, who get this book, there will be a bit of a field day, because we have paid attention to every little detail along the way. And that's kind of one of the wonderful things for me as a designer and a photographer, is that being part of this, first of all, it's easier than working on your own work. Everyone knows that one of the hardest things is examining your own body of work. So as a photographer, it would take me so much longer if I was trying to design my own book. And it's why collaborative work is so important. Just like Wesley said, he had 20 people involved in helping him wrap his head around the tighter, more difficult parts of the curation. It would have been next to impossible to do on his own. Could he have done it? He's a professional curator, but it's so much easier when you can work with someone else's work. And it's been such a privilege as a designer to work with such a good, tight body of work. And it's wonderful for me as well, because the process of designing it and trying to do justice and honor the photographic work in the physical form echoes his project, because it's all about me having to pay attention to details I wouldn't necessarily have paid attention to if I was just looking at images. If I was just looking at a carousel of his photos on Instagram, I'm going to appreciate them, but I'm not having to notice and pay attention. And as a designer, that's exactly what I have to do. I have to go into that level of detail. And the fact that Wesley understands that, both from the project perspective, but also from just a someone who has done loads of other things outside of photography. So this broad view of the world has made it one of my favorite creative and design projects that I've ever had a chance to work on. And I'll let Wesley speak to some of the other details, but that, I think, that ease of the collaboration is also what led to the decision to turn it into a publishing company that we would both kind of co-run.
I want to just jump in, because if your interest has been sparked in this book at all, I'm going to have links down below as to where you can pre-order it or order it, depending on when you're watching this. But Wesley, I just wanted you to speak a little bit to the pre-order and the special that you get if you are able to get it before that April 27th date. And yeah, it's more of a behind the scenes. It's your notes. It's a cool, just little booklet that you're giving out. And I don't know if you can get it after the pre-order special, but just can you speak into that a little bit?
It will only be available during the pre-order window, which ends April 27th. But one of the things that both Dan and I have a background in education, and my entire family is teachers. I have a mailing list newsletter called Process, which is about the process of photography, and I love sharing knowledge. And so it was very natural for us to say, you know what? It'd be really fun to have a bonus zine that's like a separate object, and it's designed to fit with the book, that comes with the book as like a little thank you for pre-ordering. So it's a free addition to the book, but only for the pre-orders. And that zine has the whole documentation of the whole process of what we're talking about right now, like my notes, pictures of those Zoom sessions with friends where we're doing a curation, different like test prints, all that kind of behind the scenes stuff. And that's like I'm calling it the behind the scenes zine because it just rhymes, but really it says behind the scenes journal, because that's what it is. It's a journal of Dan and I's collaboration and the process of making the book.
Well, I am super excited for the book. I've already pre-ordered it, and hopefully you're watching this before that April 27th date, and you can get that zine of the behind the scenes zine. But yeah, I'll have links below so you can order the book, and even if it's after the deadline for the pre-order, this is just a really, really cool piece that will hopefully inspire you, or just even watching this, maybe it's inspired you to want to go and create, to want to go shoot. I know back when I interviewed you before during COVID, it really challenged me to just go out and shoot and keep on shooting. So that's what we try to do here on this channel, is inspire you. We try to educate you on different things. And yeah, so would love to hear from you, what you thought of this, what you learned, maybe what you're going to challenge. Make this a place where you can actually state what you're going to do, where you're going to challenge yourself to go create. Sometimes when you write stuff down and you can be held accountable. But hopefully that is something for you, that you learned something. Check out Wesley's book. Thank you guys for taking the time to share with us, for creating and just doing what you do for the photo community. It is so great. But thank you guys so much. And we will see you on the next one.